a tower, a city, a name, that is all they wanted. And for that, for nothing more than that, God came down. The plain of Shinar, one people, one language, one dream, and a decision that fractured the entire human story into 1,000 directions. We call it Babel, but that name doesn't quite capture what it was. What it was the moment humanity looked up at heaven and decided it was a destination, not a gift, not a home reserved for something greater, a destination, something reachable, something that could be built toward, brick by brick, decision by decision, ambition by ambition. Here's what I need you to sit with before we go any further. This is not a story about architecture. It was never about a tower. It is a story about the human heart when it decides it no longer needs to receive, it only needs to achieve. Let these words carry you into rest tonight. Let your body settle, let your breathing slow, and let the weight of this ancient question descend over you gently, the way dust descends over a plain. What happens to a civilization that tries to make its own name? The plain of Shinar, Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. Read that slowly. Let it land. One language, one speech. Not simply one tongue, one way of seeing the world, one shared framework for reality, one common architecture of the mind. When you and I speak the same language, we do not merely exchange words, we exchange worlds. We move through the same conceptual rooms. We dream the same kind of dreams. We name our fears with the same sounds and reach for our hopes with the same syllables. There is an intimacy in shared language that goes all the way down, past culture, past habit, into something close to the bone. Now imagine that intimacy extended across every human being alive, every child born anywhere on earth, every elder sitting by every fire, every mother singing to every newborn in the dark, one shared tongue, one shared way of making the world mean something. This is where our story begins, not in chaos, not in division, not in the rubble of something broken. It begins in unity so complete it had never been seen before, and after what follows would never be seen again. The people journeyed east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. I want you to notice what the text does not say. It does not say God told them to settle. It does not say a voice came from the sky and named this plain as their place. It says they found it. They arrived. They looked at the flat golden ground and the wide sky overhead, and they stopped. That stopping, that settling, that quiet decision to plant themselves in one place and call it home. That is the first fissure in the story. Because up to this point, the mandate God had given humanity was simple. Fill the earth, spread, scatter, move across the whole face of creation, and carry the image of God into every corner of it. But they found a plain, and they stopped. Let that sit with you for a moment before we move forward, because we all know what it feels like to find a plain, a place comfortable enough, a situation familiar enough, a version of life that asks nothing more of us than staying, and the pull of that plain, the seduction of remaining rather than going, of gathering rather than scattering, is as old as humanity itself. We have all stood on our own plain of Shinar. We have all looked at the wide horizon and chosen instead to build. Chapter 1, One People, One Language. To understand what happened at Babel, you have to understand what was at stake in that unity. One language is not a small thing. Today, there are approximately 7,000 languages spoken across the earth. Each one carries a different map of reality. Each one encodes different values, different metaphors, different relationships between the self and the world. In the Hopi language of North America, time is not divided into past, present, and future the way it is in English. It is experienced more as a single unfolding, a continuous becoming rather than a sequence of moments. The grammar itself resists the idea that the past is gone and the future is not yet here. Everything, in some sense, is happening. The people of the Amazon who speak Piraha have no recursive language, no way of saying things like, he said that she believed that they went. Their language is radically present, radically immediate, and it shapes a relationship with experience that is entirely different from the one an English speaker carries through their days. Ancient Greek had 4 separate words for love: eros, the love that desires and reaches and hungers; philia, the love of deep friendship, of companionship built over years of shared life; storge, the love of family, of the ones we are bound to before we choose anything; and agape, the love that gives without expectation, without return, without limit. English has one word: love. And so we spend our lives trying to distinguish between its many flavors using only a single syllable. Language is not a tool we pick up and put down. Language is the house we live inside. It shapes what we can think. It determines what we can name. And what we cannot name, we struggle to fully know. It gives us the particular angle from which we see reality, and it binds us to the others who share that angle. Now imagine one language, one house, every mind on earth sharing the same rooms, the same walls, the same windows looking out onto the same conceptual landscape. What could such a people understand? What could they build? What would be impossible to them? God himself answers that question. And the answer is stunning. Genesis 11 verse 6. If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Let those words rest in the air for a moment. Nothing they plan will be impossible. This is not a figure of speech. This is not a rhetorical flourish. This is the divine assessment of unified human potential. God himself, the maker of all things, the one for whom nothing is impossible, is saying that unified humanity approaches something like that. Nothing they plan will be impossible for them. And God is not saying this with admiration. He is not looking down with the warm pride of a parent watching a child succeed. He is saying it with something else, something closer to grief, something closer to the weight of a doctor who has seen this condition before and already knows how it ends. Because he has seen it, he has already seen what humanity does when it is left to its own trajectory. He saw it in the generations before the flood. The world where every inclination of the human heart was only evil, continuously, not sometimes evil, not partially evil, only evil, all the time. That world had been washed clean. Noah and his family had stepped out onto a new earth with a fresh covenant and the sky full of promise. And now, not many generations later, here they are. One language, one dream, one direction. And the direction is not toward God. Here is something the story of Babel asks us to sit with, and it is uncomfortable. Unity is not inherently holy. We have been taught, rightly before, to prize unity, to seek it, to mourn its absence, and there is wisdom in that instinct. Division is a wound. Fragmentation costs something real. The body divided against itself cannot stand. But unity in the wrong direction is not a virtue. It is a force multiplier for whatever direction it is pointed. An army is unified, a lynch mob is unified, an addiction is a kind of unity, the whole person organized around a single hunger. Every tragedy in history has had its moment of collective will, its moment when many people moved as one towards something terrible and called it progress. Babel is the story of a civilization that had everything, language, cooperation, capability, vision, and aimed it all at the wrong thing. Not because they were monsters, because they were afraid. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's slow down and look at exactly what they built and why. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Pride. Verse 3. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And verse 4. "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." 3 times in this short passage the phrase "let us" appears. Let us make bricks. Let us build a city. Let us make a name for ourselves. 3 times. And if you know the rest of the scripture, you know that this phrase appears only a handful of times across the entire sweep of it. And one of those times, meditative, perhaps the most important of all, is in Genesis 1 verse 26. Let us make mankind in our image. The people of Shinar are not simply organizing a construction project. They are reaching for the grammar of God. They are using the language of the divine council, the language God speaks when He makes the world. They are not followers building something for their Creator. They are imitating the Creator. They are declaring in the very structure of their speech that they have the same authority to make and to make meaning that God has. Let us, let us, let us. 3 times the echo sounds, and each time it lands a little heavier. Now let's look at the motive, because the text gives it to us plainly. It does not hide it or dress it up, or make it sound better than it is. They wanted to make a name for themselves. A name. In the ancient world, a name was not simply a label attached to a person for convenience. A name was an essence. A name was an identity so complete that to know someone's name was to know something of their soul. To speak the name of the dead was to keep them alive in some meaningful sense. To have your name forgotten was to have never truly existed. The kings of ancient Mesopotamia, the civilization that surrounded the people of Shinar, understood this completely. They carved their names into stone. They built monuments designed to outlast 100 generations. They commissioned histories that centered their greatness and erased their failures. All of it was the same project. The project of the name. The project of being remembered. Of surviving death through reputation. Of becoming, in some sense, permanent in a world where everything is temporary. And so, the people of Shinar, building their tower and their city, were building something very specific. They were building a legacy. They were building a reason to be remembered. They were building against the terrible silence that followed when the last person who knew you has also died, and the world moves on without even noticing your absence. They were building against oblivion. And then, tucked at the end of the verse, almost like an afterthought, but actually the most revealing line of all. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. There it is, the fear beneath the ambition. They knew the mandate. Fill the earth, scatter, go. They had heard it, they understood it, and they looked at it and said, "No, we will not scatter. We will not be small. We will not be diffuse and dispersed and forgotten in 100 different corners of a world too large to care about any of us. We will stay here, together, and we will build something so tall and so permanent that it becomes a name, that it becomes a monument to the fact of our existence. Here is what I need you to sit with. Pride, in its deepest form, is not arrogance. It is not the swagger of someone who has inflated their sense of themselves beyond what reality supports. Arrogance is almost a surface condition, loud, visible, easy to identify and correct. Pride, in its deepest form, is something quieter and harder to reach. Pride is fear, fear of smallness, fear of insignificance, fear of being exactly as finite, as mortal, as forgettable as you actually are. Fear that when you are gone, the world will not notice. Fear that the life you are living, however full, however earnest, however genuinely good, is not enough to matter, not enough to leave a mark, not enough to echo forward into the silence that follows. The tower was not a declaration of power. It was a monument built over the mouth of a terror. Every wisdom tradition in human history has grappled with this terror. Not one of them has been able to make it disappear. They have only found different ways to hold it. The Stoics looked at the terror of mortality and developed the practice of memento mori. Remember that you will die, not as a morbid fixation, but as a daily exercise in proportion. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, a document he never intended anyone to read, about the great emperors and conquerors of the past, men who had built empires, men whose names had once filled the mouths of every person on earth. And then he wrote, simply, where are they now? Not to diminish them, but to free himself from the grip of the same hunger. The Buddhist tradition approaches the same terror from a different angle. The teaching of Phanika, impermanence, holds that suffering arises not from the fact that things end, but from our refusal to accept that they will. The grasping, the clinging, the frantic building of towers against the tide. Suffering is not in the ending, it is in the resistance to the ending. The prophet Isaiah, writing centuries after Babel, described the same impulse in the soul of a king. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly. That is not the speech of someone who has too much. That is the speech of someone who is terrified of having too little, of being too small, of being seen, finally, as the ordinary and mortal creature they are. Babel was not a story about a civilization that became too powerful. It was the story of a civilization that became too afraid. And the tower, brick by beautiful, carefully laid brick, was the shape that fear took when it had enough people and enough time and enough shared language to build. Chapter 3. What were they actually building? The text says they built a tower that reaches to the heavens. For centuries, readers have taken this literally and asked, did they really believe they could build a structure tall enough to reach the sky? Did the ancient mind conceive of heaven as a physical location, a place above the clouds that could theoretically be accessed by a sufficiently ambitious staircase? Probably, in some measure, yes. The ancient cosmology was different from ours. The sky was a kind of ceiling. The heavens were above it, and above the heavens the realm of God. But the literal reading, while not wrong, is also not the deepest reading. Because in the ancient Near East, the ziggurat, the great step temple tower that archaeologists have found across what is now Iraq and Iran, was never simply a tall building. It was a cosmic mountain. Every ancient culture with access to mountains understood the mountain as the meeting place of heaven and earth, the high place, the place where the divine came close enough to touch. Moses met God on Sinai. Elijah heard the still small voice on Horeb. The gods of Greece lived on Olympus. The gods of the ancient Near East were associated with the peaks that rose above the plains. But the people of the plain of Shinar had no mountains. They lived in a flat, vast, featureless landscape, and so they built one. The ziggurat was a constructed mountain. It was the axis mundi, the axis of the world, the place the builders placed at the center of reality, where heaven touched earth, where the divine condescended to make contact with the human. These structures were not monuments to human greatness. They were, in their designer's intention, houses for the gods, temples, places where the divine presence could descend and dwell among the people. But here is the turn. Here is the thing that makes the Babel ziggurat different from every other temple tower built in the ancient world. The other ziggurats were built for the gods of the people, places where the local deity would come and be served and be honored. They were built as acts of worship, as acts of invitation. The Babel Tower was built so that the people could make a name for themselves, not for God, for themselves. The gesture looks the same from the outside, a tower rising towards heaven, but the intention is entirely different. One reaches toward heaven as an act of offering, the other reaches toward heaven as an act of engineering. One says, "Come," the other says, "I'm coming up." This is the theological fracture at the heart of Babel, and it is far more precise and far more personal than the broad charge of pride usually captures. It is the difference between prayer and control. Prayer is a posture of reception. It is the acknowledgement that the divine comes on its own terms, in its own time, in its own way. That we do not manufacture the encounter. We do not create the conditions under which God is obligated to appear. We open, we wait, we receive. The tower was the opposite of prayer. The tower was the attempt to engineer proximity, to build something so large, so impressive, so permanent that heaven would have no choice but to take notice, to create the conditions under which God, or the gods, or the divine, or the universe, or whatever name you give to the transcendent, would have to respond. It was theology as construction project, worship reframed as leverage. And this is where the story stops being ancient. This is where the plain of Shinar becomes uncomfortably familiar, because the impulse is not dead. It has never died. It shows up in every generation, in every culture, in every human heart that has ever felt the terror of being finite and responded by building something. We build towers still, not of brick and bitumen, not of fire clay and mortar on a Mesopotamian plain, but of achievement and recognition, of credentials and platforms, of followers and influence, of content and output and productivity, and the endless, exhausting reaching for the thing that will make us feel that our existence has been justified. We build careers that are really towers. We build audiences that are really towers. We build reputations and legacies, and brands and bodies of work. And sometimes these things are genuinely good, genuinely offered, genuinely made in service of something beyond ourselves. But sometimes, and we know the difference even when we refuse to name it, sometimes they are towers. Sometimes the platform is the monument. Sometimes the credential is the brick. Sometimes the thing we have told ourselves is a calling is actually a city we are building to our own name. Here is what I need you to sit with as your body settles into rest. What are you building? Not what you say you are building. Not the language you use to describe it to others or to yourself in the quieter moments. Not the spiritual framing you have placed around the ambition to make it feel less like ambition. Why, at the deepest and most honest level, are you building? Is it to serve? Or is it to be seen? Is it to offer? Or is it to secure? Is it to give something away freely? Or is it to build something tall enough that you will never have to feel small again? The people of Shinar were not villains. That is important. The text does not call them wicked. It does not say their hearts were evil. It does not compare them to the generation before the flood. It simply says they were capable and unified and building in the wrong direction. And that is a far more uncomfortable diagnosis than wickedness, because wickedness is easy to locate in someone else. But misdirected capability, sincere ambition, real talent, genuine energy, all pointed at the wrong thing. that lives very close to home. That is the architecture of Babel, and it is always somewhere under construction. Chapter 4, God comes down, verse 5. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord came down. Let those words sit for a moment. They were building up, reaching up, straining upward with every brick, every fired clay, every carefully applied layer of bitumen. And God came down, not because the tower had reached him, not because the engineering was so impressive that it breached the divine realm, not because the sound of the construction had filtered upward through the heavens and disturbed something. God came down because whatever they were building was, in the scale of eternity, so small that he had to descend to even see it. The tower that was meant to touch heaven could not even be seen from heaven without God choosing to approach it. There is a quiet, devastating irony in this, and the ancient readers would have felt it immediately. The very thing that was meant to close the distance between humanity and God revealed, by the manner of God's response, how vast that distance actually was. The tower did not shorten the gap, it illustrated it. But I want to be careful here, because this is not mockery. This is not God being cruel or contemptuous towards the builders. The posture of the divine in this passage is not one of offended power or punishing wrath. It is something much more like the sadness of someone who has seen this before, who knows what this kind of reaching costs, who knows where this road leads. Verse 6 through 7. If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Let us go down. Again, the divine council language. The same construction that appeared in creation, let us make, now appears in intervention. Let us go down. And the intervention is surgical, precise. God does not send fire. He does not call down the flood again. He has made a covenant with the sign of the rainbow that he will not. He does not destroy the tower. He does not level the city. He does not strike down the builders or scatter them by force of wind or earthquake. He simply touches language. He reaches into the shared imagination of the entire human race and fragments it, not into chaos, into difference, not into opposition, into plurality. He does not turn them against each other. He makes them to each other suddenly strange, suddenly other, suddenly harder to understand, and the project stops, not with a catastrophe, with an incomprehension. Now I want to stay here, in this moment, for longer than we usually do, because I think the response of God at Babel is one of the most philosophically interesting divine acts in all of Scripture, and it is almost always read too quickly. We read it as punishment, as consequence, as the moment God's patience ran out and he brought down judgment on a proud civilization. But look at what he actually does. He does not undo what they built. He undoes the condition that made the building possible. The tower was not the problem. The problem was a human unity of purpose, human unity of language, human unity of will, all pointed away from God and toward a self-constructed name. So God does not destroy the project, he dissolves the precondition. This is the action not of an offended tyrant, but of a physician who understands that the symptom is not a disease. You do not treat a fever by pouring cold water on the thermometer. You treat the condition that is producing the heat. And the condition here was not the tower. It was the direction, it was the gathering, it was the choosing of concentration over diffusion, of monument over mission, of name over faithfulness. And so God gives them the very thing they were running from. He scatters them. Is the scattering a punishment, or is it something else? The text calls it a confusion. a mixing, a babbling, which is of course where the name Babel comes from. The city was called Babel, Babylon, meaning gate of God or gate of the gods. But in the wordplay of the Hebrew text it sounds like Balal, to mix, to confuse, to pour together until the distinctions blur. The name of the city meant gateway to heaven, but its legacy became the place of incomprehension. And yet, what if the incomprehension is not a curse? What if the confusion is a mercy dressed in the grammar of judgment? God had said, "Fill the earth." They had refused. They had gathered. They had concentrated their power and their language and their will into a single location, a single project, a single name. And God did, finally, what they would not do willingly. He sent them out. He gave them, by force, at first, and against their will, the diversity they had tried to escape, the difference they had worked so hard to overcome, the plurality they had tried to collapse into a single monument-worthy identity. Every language that was born at Babel carried within it a new way of seeing, a new way of being human, a new angle on the image of God in which humanity was made. The people did not lose themselves in the scattering. They became, in the scattering, more of what they were always meant to be: varied, distributed, spread across the whole face of the earth they had been given. The scattering was not the end of human potential, it was its multiplication. Chapter 5: The Philosophy of Scattering. Every great wisdom tradition has something to say about the experience of being scattered. The Jewish tradition made it into a defining theology. The diaspora, the scattering of God's people across the known world, first to Babylon, then further still, became not simply a catastrophe to be mourned, but a calling to be inhabited. The rabbis came, slowly and painfully, to understand that Israel's presence among the nations was not an accident of history, not a failure of divine protection, not evidence that God had looked away. It was a design. Light cannot illuminate a room if it is kept in a single lamp. Salt cannot season a meal if it is left in a pile in the corner. A seed cannot grow if it will not leave the hand that holds it. The Stoics had their own version of this understanding. Seneca wrote about the citizen of the world, the cosmopolitan in the original sense, not the person who belongs everywhere in the sense of belonging nowhere, but the person who carries their home within them, who is not diminished by being placed in unfamiliar territory because their identity does not depend on location. Marcus Aurelius, writing from a throne, from the concentrated center of the most powerful empire on earth, spent his private journals training himself to remember that he was, at the end of everything, simply a human being, one of many, part of a whole. Not the point of the story. He was, in his inner life, practicing a kind of voluntary scattering, a release of the claim to the center. There is a kind of smallness that masquerades as depth, a kind of concentration that mistakes intensity for meaning. We gather our energies into a single point, a single project, a single identity, a single name, and we call it focus. We call it discipline. We call it knowing what we are about, and sometimes it is those things. But sometimes, and we need to be honest about this, and sometimes it is Babel. Sometimes the focus is really the fear of going. Sometimes the discipline is really the refusal to scatter. Sometimes the clarity of vision is really the terror of being distributed across more of the world than we feel we can control. The people of Shinar were not building from abundance. They were building from scarcity, from the deep, unspoken terror that without the tower, they were not enough. That without the city, the name, the monument, They would be forgotten by a world that does not pause to remember the small and the scattered. And the scattering, the divine insistence that they go, was the answer to a question they had not yet learned to ask. Not, how do we make a name for ourselves, but what if we were already named? Genesis 12 opens immediately after the fall of Babel. Immediately. The narrative does not pause. It does not offer a long transition or an explanatory bridge. The scattering ends in chapter 11, and in chapter 12, a man named Abram hears a voice. And the voice says, simply, go, leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will show you. Not, here are the coordinates. Not, here is a map and a detailed itinerary. I will show you, as you go, one step at a time. And then, the voice makes a promise that lands with all the weight of Babel behind it. I will make your name great. I will make your name great. Let that land for a moment. The same desire, the same ancient human longing for significance, for legacy, for the name that outlasts body. The people of Babel wanted it. Abram wanted it. You want it. I want it. It is not a shameful wanting, but two entirely different postures toward it. One built, one walked, one gathered, one was sent, one reached for the name and lost the language they needed to keep it. One simply went into uncertainty, into the unfamiliar, into a land he had never seen, and received the name as a gift he had done nothing to construct. This is the counterpoint the text offers to Babel. Not, stop wanting to matter. You were made to matter. But the name worth having cannot be built. It can only be given, and it is given to those who go. Chapter 6. Language, loss, and the strange gift of the other. When the languages were confused at Babel, the people did not simply lose the ability to communicate. They lost each other. And that loss, the experience of being surrounded by people who can no longer understand you, who look at you with a kind of helpless incomprehension, who mean well but whose words land in your ears as noise, that is one of the oldest and deepest wounds in the human story. Sit with that for a moment. You have known something of it. Not from Babel, perhaps, but from the loneliness that descends when you try to explain something essential about your interior life and the person in front of you. The person who loves you, who is trying, who wants to understand, simply cannot find the door. Some experiences are not translatable. Some griefs resist language. Some joys are so specific to a particular history, a particular way of being formed, that to share them fully you would need to give the other person your whole life as context. Language is not simply a system of communication, it is a system of belonging. And when you lose the shared language, you lose, in some real way, the shared world. The philosopher George Steiner spent much of his life thinking about this. He was a polyglot. He lived inside several languages, moved between them with ease. And yet, he wrote movingly about the loneliness embedded in the very fact of linguistic difference, not as a problem to be solved, as a reality to be inhabited with honesty. He observed that every language opens a dimension of reality that other languages cannot access. Not better, not more complete, different. Each tongue carries a particular refraction of the infinite, and no single language, however rich, however ancient, however precise, can hold all of it. If that is true, then the encounter with the person who speaks differently, who sees the world through a different grammar, who names the same emotions with different sounds, who has inherited a different relationship to time and loss and hope, is not only a challenge to be navigated. It is a gift. It is the possibility of seeing what your own language cannot show you. The confusion of Babel was real. The loss was real. The loneliness of the scattering was real. And it is not sentimental to acknowledge that. The people who found themselves suddenly unable to understand the faces around them were not experiencing a theoretical, philosophical problem. They were experiencing grief. But within that grief, something was being given. The necessity of the other, the inescapable, structurally built-in requirement to lean toward the person whose words you cannot yet hear clearly and try. To stay curious rather than retreat into the comfort of the already understood. To hold your own particular way of seeing with enough humility to recognize that the person beside you, the one whose words land strangely, whose framing of reality feels unfamiliar, whose metaphors come from a world you have not lived in, carries something you need. Every wisdom tradition has wrestled with this. Isaiah spoke of the servant of the Lord as a light to the nations, not over them, not against them, to them, for them. The scattering was not conquest. It was gift-giving to people who did not know the gift was coming. The early church, filled with the Spirit at Pentecost, found itself doing something that looked like the reversal of Babel. Not one language imposed on everyone, but many languages suddenly comprehensible. Many tongues, many cultures, many angles of seeing, and each one heard the same good news in the idiom of their own formation. What Babel broke, Pentecost did not simply repair, it transformed. The scattering became the sending. The confusion became the chorus. The wound became the instrument. And here, in this transformed reading of the scattering, is something I want to leave you with. The diffuseness you resist. The ways your life feels spread across too many directions, too many relationships, too many callings, too many places that ask something of you. The sense that you cannot concentrate yourself into a single tower, a single monument, a single name worth making. That may not be the wound you have named it. It may be the assignment. The scattering is not always exile. Sometimes it is the form your particular faithfulness takes. Sometimes the spread is the point. Sometimes the way you carry the image of God into the world is precisely by going to the places that no concentrated, monument-building version of yourself would ever have reached. Not every gift can be given from one location. Some gifts require going. Chapter 7. What we build. When we cannot touch heaven, we have spent this night walking the plain of Shinar. We have stood beside the builders as they said, Let us make bricks. Let us build a city. Let us make a name. We have looked at the tower, at what it was reaching for and what it was running from. We have watched God come down. We have felt the languages scatter. We have followed the people as they moved, bewildered and perhaps afraid, into the wide world they had refused. And at each turn, the same question has waited quietly beneath everything else. What does this mean for us? Not for a civilization that existed 4,000 years ago on a plane we cannot locate with certainty. Not for an archaeological category, or a literary analysis, or a theological debate. For us, for you, for the person listening tonight, on whatever plane of Shinar they have settled, whatever comfortable, familiar, monument-building version of their life they have organized themselves around. Let's not look away from what actually happens at the end of the story. The tower is not destroyed. The text does not say God tore it down. It does not say fire fell on it, or that it crumbled, or that the earth swallowed it. It says the people stopped building, they were scattered, and the project simply stopped, not with catastrophe, with abandonment. And then, as quietly as the text allows, the narrative moves on. Verse 8. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. They stopped building the city, and immediately, in the very next chapter, God finds a man on a road, a man who is going somewhere. And God speaks to him and says, "Keep going. I am with you." And from that going, that simple, faithful walking into uncertainty, something begins that the tower could never have built. What do we build when we cannot touch heaven? Every wisdom tradition offers a version of the same answer, and the answer is always, at its core, a reduction of scale, a narrowing of scope, a turning away from the monument and towards the person in front of you. The Stoics called it the discipline of action, not the grand gesture, but the faithful, consistent, available small thing. Marcus Aurelius. Do not indulge in dreams of what you would do in some perfect future circumstance. Do the good that is available to you today, in this hour, with the people you are actually with. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of the miracle of the present moment, that washing a dish, when washed with full presence and attention, is not a lesser act than climbing a mountain. The miracle is not in the scale, it is in the quality of presence brought to whatever scale you are given. The prophet Jeremiah, writing to the exiles, to the people who had been scattered from Jerusalem to Babylon, who had lost their temple and their city and their king and everything they had organized their identity around, wrote a letter that has no business being as gentle as it is. He wrote, "Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." Build houses, not towers, not monuments, not civilizational achievements designed to outlast 100 generations and carry your name forward into the dim future where no one remembers who you were. Houses, gardens, peace for the city you did not choose. The answer to the failed tower is not no building, it is different building. Smaller building, building that serves the place where you actually are, rather than the name you would like to have. Building that asks not, how high can this reach, but how well can this shelter? There is a kind of greatness that fits inside a house. There is a kind of name that does not need a tower to be carried. Abraham found this. He left. He did not build. He followed a voice into territory he could not see in advance. And he walked and he trusted. And one day God said to him, "I will make your name great." And his name became the foundation of 3 of the world's great faiths, not because he built high, but because he went far. Not because he concentrated his power into a monument, but because he distributed his faithfulness across a journey. Not every tower that falls was meant to stand, and not every name worth having can be made. Some names are only given. The plain of Shinar is quiet now, under its wide amber sky. The half-built tower stands at the edge of history, not destroyed, the text tells us, simply left. Left to the slow work of wind and time, left as a monument to the dream that was real and human and turned in the wrong direction. And the people, the builders, the brickmakers, the ones who spoke the grammar of the divine council and aimed it at their own names. They are gone into the world, scattered across it, carrying their new languages like new selves, like new angles of seeing, like seeds dispersed across a field that is bigger than any one of them can comprehend. And something grows. Let me leave you with this. Tonight, as the noise of the day recedes and your body settles toward its rest, carry with you not the weight of Babel, but the wisdom of it. You are not Babel, but you carry it. Every human being carries it. the longing to be significant, the hunger for the name that outlasts the forgetting, the quiet terror underneath the ambition that without the tower, without the thing being built, the thing being achieved, the thing being made, you might simply be ordinary, finite, forgettable, human. That longing is not your enemy. It is the image of God in you, pressing against its own limits, reaching toward its origin. It is the creature knowing, even dimly, even wrongly, even in the distorted grammar of pride, that it was made to matter. The question is not whether you long for a name. The question is what you do with the longing. Do you build toward heaven, brick by brick, and call it ambition? Or do you open your hands and call it prayer? Do you gather yourself into a monument? Or do you allow yourself to be scattered into the places where your particular light is needed? The scattering is not always a judgment. Sometimes the thing that is pried from your grip, the project, the platform, the plan, the monument you were building to the sound of your own name, is not a punishment. It is the beginning of the thing you were actually made for. And the place you are scattered to is not exile. It is assignment. Let your breathing slow now. Let the plain of Shinar recede into the distance, warm and ancient, and no longer yours to worry about. Let the tower stand, half-built, in some corner of memory, as a reminder that some things are better left unfinished, that some ambitions do more good abandoned than completed, that there is a mercy in the stopping that pride never learns, and let the only name that matters, the one spoken over you before you knew how to reach for anything, let that name carry you now into rest. You do not have to build tonight. You do not have to reach. You only have to receive the sleep you are given and wake tomorrow into the small, faithful, house building, garden planting, neighbor seeking life that, in the economy of God, has always been the point. He grants sleep to those he loves. Rest now. The plain is quiet, the sky is wide, and the God who came down to see the tower sees you too, not with disappointment, not with the measuring eye of a builder judging your output, but with the steady, unhurried gaze of the one who already knows your name. Sleep well, and may you wake knowing that the name worth having was never one you had to make.